you show, as you've been saying, how stigma is manufactured by people in power. So you've spoken about the government, obviously, the media, but also other institutions. We might think even about educational institutions, health, and so on, not just mental, but also physical health. But stigma is really something that's felt by individuals, so carried by individuals themselves. So this is about the process of stigmatization. Can you explain that for us?
Yeah, so stigmatization historically, so this is one of the things that I was quite interested to find out about. It's a Greek word, it's from ancient Greece, and it was used to describe how people were tattooed, literally tattooed, so actually tattooed. So enslaved people in ancient Greece, for example, who committed a crime or an offence might be tattooed on their head with "I am a thief." So the word stigma literally meant the tattoo, which was which only certain classes of people were subject to. Now, of course, that was to mark somebody out, but how we use stigma today, from the 20th century really onwards, is also to think about the feelings associated with that. So it's a shift from describing just the practice of marking to how that's sort of experienced, or the feelings associated with it, the negative feelings. So I was quite interested in thinking about those two things together, the marking and how then an individual is inscribed with stigma, and then how that's experienced and lived and felt. So I suppose my way of thinking about stigma is a psychosocial process, that it's felt and lived and experienced by the individual, and not necessarily in the same way by different individuals. I'll come back to that in a moment, but that it's psychological, but it's also social. But I suppose one thing that's important to think about is that, not everybody, stigma doesn't always work. So stigma may be produced, for example, there may be a very stigmatized depiction of working class people on television, but doesn't necessarily mean that anyone watching that who's working class is going to feel those negative feelings. There are ways that historically we know people can defend themselves against stigma, or work with the stigma in ways that perhaps transcode it. That might mean something that is a slur or a negative stigmatized term may be reclaimed by communities as a positive term. And I write about that in the book in relationship to Black Power, and how the Black Power movement in a way took stigmatized forms of racialized slurs from white majority communities and may rework those stigmas into kind of countercultural movements. But when stigma does work, you do feel stigmatized, and some of the people I write about in the book describe that to me, and I open the book with an account of somebody talking about what it's like to experience stigma. It can be devastating on somebody's mental health. And if you feel if those feelings really get under your skin and start to impact yourself, so people call this self-stigmatization, you start to almost stigmatize yourself because you believe those cultural and social stories or names about you, or that they're referring to you. So it can be a devastating and deep way of sort of immobilizing people, actually.
I think it's really interesting what you've said about Black Power, the Black Power movement, because we opened our subject this year, this semester, with talking about the Black Panther Party and their functional definition of politics. And last week, we spoke about Indigenous resistance in Australia, and in particular, the Aboriginal Black Power movement. And so this collectivism is really important. So I presume part of what happens with self-stigmatization, the process you've been describing, is also when people are isolated, when they don't necessarily have community.
That's exactly right. So in a way, in the more psychological literature on stigma that I'm trying to, in a way, respond to in my work or add something to is very much on how an individual might be helped to overcome stigma. And what I'm actually interested in addition to that, is thinking about how forms of, for example, consciousness raising that are more political can help people understand that that stigma is nothing to do with them, it's coming from somewhere else. And actually, how can they rework that collectively, and sometimes as a political practice, to challenge, to overcome the debilitating impact of stigma and of those stigmas, and actually work together. So actually, collective responses to stigma are actually key to understanding how we might resist stigma.